Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by Dwayne, who's a professional photographer from Atlanta, Georgia. This is going to be a two-part daily critique. Today we're going to talk more about the idea of composition and design, and specifically we're going to talk about the flow of energy in an image. Tomorrow we're going to talk more about just the technical approach of shooting a shot like this, where you're shooting a skyline or panoramic skyline, any kind of a cityscape at night. We're going to get into some techniques connected to that. Really interesting backstory on this image. Speaking of technique, pretty complicated technically at the level of camera. Also really interesting, Dwayne says that it took him several months to just find this vantage point for the shot and then get the permission to actually shoot from here, and boy could I relate to that. Shot property is a specialty in my commercial photography career, and so I know exactly what Dwayne is talking about in that part of the backstory. And Dwayne says this photo was specifically shot to convey the lights and action of the city and to show or convey the size and prominence of Atlantic Station, which is this development, pretty new in Atlanta relative to the older part of the city. And Dwayne goes on to give us his technical data here, so pretty complicated. Dwayne shot this with a Nikon D300, 17 to 55 zoom at 22 millimeters and at f11. And from my understanding of this process, Dwayne has 3 panels here. And within each panel from the tripod, he bracketed a series of exposures going from light to dark and used photomatics to create an HDR version of those images. And what is HDR? It's high dynamic range. Photomatics takes the different exposures and blends them in a way so that the viewer sees a greater range than the camera could see in one shot, from the brightest thing in the scene to the darkest thing in the scene. And each of those 3 HDR shots have been stuck together, stitched, by Panoramic Factory version 4. Dwayne says, I thought about adding the moon or some stars, but I don't know if it would help or just confuse the situation. Your overall impression would be greatly appreciated. Let's get right into it. One of my first impressions is the value of persistence, tenacity, and hard work. And I also know that for those things to show up, that more than likely some kind of very powerful purpose is going to have to be behind them. So much of the time that purpose is love. Either we just love what we're doing so much that we really go to these extraordinary lengths to do the things that we do, and for those people it typically doesn't feel like that. It just feels like a wonderful, exhilarating part of the process. Or we might do something sort of Herculean at the level of action based on love for another person. So much of the time the love is going to need to be there for the hard work and the persistence and the tenacity to be there. So I just wanted to mention those things, a real basic level of process. And I also wanted to mention how much I love this view of the skyline of downtown Atlanta, because it is novel. I haven't seen this city from this vantage point. Also, I haven't seen Atlantic Station and this new stuff in the context of the rest of the city. So I'm loving that as a native Atlantan. And I also love the design of this image. I love the panoramic format. Obviously, Dwayne needs that to put this in a context without ending up with a whole bunch of sky and a whole bunch of stuff down here at the bottom. The panoramic works real well in an obvious way, but I also love within the panoramic frame this lyrical flow of movement across the top of the image. It's rhymed by a real lyrical flow of movement down here. You also get a real strong sense of something very dynamic here, not just a cross-hatching of diagonals, but if you look at the contouring lines and then connect that with implied flow of energy, you end up with a cross-hatching of S-curves. So you have contouring lines that make an S-curve, and then if you just go moving in the same flow to the next highest energy, then the next highest energy, next highest energy, and then the corner. Over here there's an implied flow of energy with these lights, then to the billboard, then to the on or off ramp, then the next most energetic thing for me would be this, then this, and then out of the corner of the frame. So that feeling of design is beautiful. You get a sense of that too in sort of these ellipses that push into each other, and that's really beautiful. Really cool design. Mike, who is a community member and also a big supporter of TME, thank you, Mike, for all your help over the years, says, could you at some point elaborate about seeing the flow of energy in an image? Is it lines associated with your subjects, or is it actual energy, for example, from a wave or a cloud, so on and so forth? The lines associated with subjects are contouring lines, and obviously they're going to play into the idea of implied energy, which is much more subjective. But these contouring lines are something that objectively we can talk about. You know, we can say that these lines make a space shape called building. And we can also have, you know, a contouring line that's such a slim line that it really just is a line. You could take a picture, for instance, horizontal picture of, let's say this is mud and someone took a stick and they scratched a line into it. That would be a contouring line that follows the path of that scratch. But a contouring line is a physical line. It's either just a line itself or it's a line that defines a shape, and those are objective. Implied flow of energy or implied line of movement, let's say from one subject, sorry about that, from one subject to the next, much more subjective, because we can't say that everybody will go from here and then keep going and go from here to here to here to here. We can say that it's implied, but we can't say that people will follow it. It's also multi-dimensional, and so I wanted to talk about that. I want to give a plug to a website that probably all of you already know about, Luminous Landscape, and specifically I love Michael Reichman, and I love what he's done there. It's helped me out a ton over the years. I also want to plug another favorite photographer and teacher, John Paul Keppernager Jr., who has a great tutorial on composition at Luminous Landscape, and I'm going to link to that because he has a really brilliant way of taking an image like this and using, let's say, a filter in Photoshop to reduce it into sort of the skeletal structure of the image. So it might be easier to look at the subject that we're talking about now, which is the movement of energy or just the basic flow of energy within an image. It's really multi-dimensional when we talk about implied energy. Let's just give a for instance. Let's pick this subject, which is one of the most powerful subjects in the image. Why is it so powerful? First of all, where it is in the frame. We have an implied flow of energy just based on the blank frame. Left-hand side has more weight than the right. Top, because of gravity, has more weight than the bottom. We also have this bit of math that are very powerful. We know about this idea of rule of thirds, which applies to 35 millimeter framing, but this is a panoramic frame. So if we apply rule of thirds theory to panoramic framing, we would get a ratio by having the short side and dividing the long side of the frame into it, coming up with a ratio, and then using that to determine the placement of a subject within the frame that would happen on a line that ratio tells us this is where you should cut the line. So in this panoramic, instead of rule of thirds, it's more like rule of quarters or rule of fifths. And this building is on one of those PowerPoints relative to this framing device. Rule of thirds would be here because this is so much longer than the short side. The main subjects get pushed out further. So you have that bit of implied energy. Then you also have the archetype of the building itself, high contrast. You have all this movement up here. So these are the kinds of things that implication of flow of energy could drive in the image. It's going to drive how we want to cut the top of this image. How much negative space do we need above this so the implication of the movement of this energy has some space to live and breathe in? It would be just like a breaking wave, and we need to consider not only the wave itself, but the viewer doesn't just say, well, this is a still photograph, so I'm going to deny everything I know to be true about reality. They make an assumption about that energy continuing to move. And this is where we start to, at the most basic level, need to start to think about the flow of energy as people move through the image. If we cut this image right here, I mean, obviously that's going to distract most people. So now let's look at it even in a more complicated way. The energy of this building also moves in this direction, and then implied energy starts to hook up with other subjects, because even though these two subjects are not physically connected, the energy flows into the other subject. How well do these work together? I think brilliantly. If you look at the overall implication of energy, you get this really sort of beautiful anchoring pyramid shape. You have nice negative space here, here, and here. This does not work at all for me relative to what I'm talking about. It blocks the implied flow of energy of the contouring lines of the roadbed. It blocks the physical contouring line itself. It ends up being a merger. It also gets on tangent with this movement of energy, and instead of having nice negative space for this at the base of it, it lines up with it and could start to block the flow of energy in this direction in the image. And then you have something else that makes this even more complicated. Psychology. Maybe somebody is afraid of skyscrapers. Maybe they hate traffic. Maybe they love to drive. Maybe they have a job here and they live in this space and they love it. Maybe they invested money here and lost, or made money. Who knows? All of those things start to have a huge effect. So we have to start to think about archetypes and those kinds of things. In the most basic sense, if I wanted to manage this image at a flow of energy, here's the things I would do. I'd get rid of that building, and I'd try and accentuate more of this design of cross-hatching S-curves. I would do a series of steps in the right-hand corner to try and accentuate this flow over here of the S-curve. And so that's what I'm going to do. You're just going to see me go through, just keep watching, a series of steps that exaggerate that line. And this is where we started and this is where we ended up. Also changed the color, but I want to talk about color tomorrow because that's enough for today. I would love to hear your feedback about the critique so far. Big thank you to Mike for his question. Love to get more questions from you about the daily critique. It really helps me to make content. Huge thank you to Dwayne. This is an awesome image. It's given us a chance to talk about a lot of things. We'll revisit it again tomorrow. Hope to see you again tomorrow on the Mindful Eyes Daily Critique.